Moj puta.
Kako se bavimo sve mi bilo jasno.
Da, ali ćete ne i kolegi ulažu što tamo.
Mislim da je to dobro da se
Se oni znam.
Razdrži normalno. Je passe une coalition.
Dear colleagues, the sitting is open. I remind members that they should insert their badge before taking the floor. As you begin your speech, please press the microphone request button once only. So, this morning, the agenda calls for the election of 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights in respect of Andorra, Armenia, and Slovenia. The list of candidates and biographical notices are to be found in documents 16085, 16080, 16027. The opinion of the committee is presented in document 16096, addendum 2. The voting will take place in the area behind the President's chair. At 1 p.m., I shall announce the closing of the poll. Counting with them will then take place under the supervision of 4 tellers who have been chosen by the political groups. The tellers are: from EPP, Sergei Vlasenko; from the Socialists, Sirka Pramer; from ALDE, Rian Vogels; from UEL, Bertrand Öztürk. I would like to remind them that they will have to be in the room set aside for this purpose at 1 p.m. The result of the vote will be announced at the beginning of this afternoon sitting. For these first ballots, an absolute majority of the votes is required. If a second round has to be organized, it will take place this afternoon from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. I now declare the ballot open, and we continue our work in the meantime. The next item of business this morning is the debate on the report titled "The Need for a Renewed Rules-Based International Order," document 16087, presented by Mrs. Dora Bakoyannis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy. This will be followed by a statement by Mr. Marko, President of the European Court of Human Rights, whom I thank for being with us today. In order to finish by 1 p.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 11:55 a.m. to allow time for the reply and the vote. I now call Mrs. Bakoyannis, Rapporteur. Dear Dora, you have 7 minutes now. I know that you want 8. I will do my best. And 3 minutes at the end, so you will have 2 at the end. You have the floor, Dora.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, allow me to begin by honoring the solemn occasion of the...
Have you inserted your buds? Yes. Press the mic and just wait for a couple of seconds.
Okay, I start again. I need a minute. Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, allow me to begin by honoring the solemn occasion of the 80th anniversary of the Holocaust. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, a chilling testament to the catastrophic failure of nations to uphold a rules-based international order. It serves as a haunting reminder of the nightmares that await us when we sleep on our shared responsibility to humanity. And today, dear colleagues, the time of dreaming has passed. The alarm has sounded. It is time to wake up and act. The report we are voting on today has as its sole purpose to serve as an alarm bell for all European citizens. It is a stark reminder that we can no longer afford illusions. We must stand on our own feet, face the reality that some of the most critical partners do not share our values, and above all, strengthen our unity. Only through solidarity and shared purpose can we ensure Europe's survival and its rightful place in the world. The time for complacency is gone. Now it's time for action. I understand that Europe isn't the most charming of concepts. It doesn't have the allure of the countless and often conflicting national myths of the peoples of Europe have cherished and nurtured over the decades. The true glue that binds us together isn't a romanticized history of sentimental nostalgia. It's our shared belief in something greater, in democracy, in human rights, in the rule of law, in freedom. These are the values that define us, that give Europe its strength and purpose. They may not be flashy, but they are the foundation of everything we stand for. Dear colleagues, 17th century French poet Nicolas Boileau once wrote, "Often the fear is one evil leads to a worse." His words resonate deeply in our current moment. The world in which Europe thrived is shifting rapidly, and it's natural to feel the pressure of being squeezed between the revisionist ambitions coming from both East and West. But if we allow fear to dictate our decisions, if we resign ourselves to the idea that a united Europe is destined for irrelevance, we will have done our competitors a great favor. It is evident that global non-European powers do not want a Europe that stands united. The principle of divide and rule remains one of the oldest and most effective strategies in the playbook of big powers. A Europe that speaks with one voice, that defends its values and interests as one, is a formidable opponent, far more difficult to challenge than a fractured Europe consumed by the rise of competing nationalism within its borders. This is precisely why the leaderships of global non-European powers actively support European political forces that openly oppose unity. They understand that a divided Europe is a weaker Europe, easier to manipulate, easier to exploit, and incapable of securing its rightful place on the global stage. We must not fall in this trap. To protect our shared values, our collective prosperity, and our future, Europe must reject the temptation of nationalism and disunity. Instead, we must reaffirm our commitment to the strength that lies in our unity, standing together as one in the face of external pressures and internal challenges alike. It is not an easy task. The adversaries of a united Europe and its core values, both within and beyond our continent, are weaponizing fake news, advancing algorithms, divisive identity politics to fracture and inflame. They also capitalize on the mistakes we made. Over the past decades, there were moments when we failed to properly explain the profound changes reshaping our societies. Moments when we neglected to support local communities grappling within the demands of globalization, and moments when we prioritized economic metrics over the feelings and concerns of the people. That must change, starting now. Dear colleagues, in these challenging times, when so many feel adrift, we must offer a vision that resonates with people, one that is both grounded in reason and built on facts. The solution to a struggling democracy can never be less democracy. It must always be better democracy. Dear colleagues, the time for complacency is over. The path forward must begin with the Council of Europe. As the guardians of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, we have the responsibility to lead by example. In the face of division and rising authoritarianism, let us reaffirm our unity, purpose, and unwavering commitment to multilateralism. This report highlights the critical need for the Council of Europe and its member states to stay actively engaged with other countries, international organizations, and partners to tackle shared challenges effectively, to counter threats to the European way of life, safeguard democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and maintain Europe's influence on the global stage. Member states must work toward an open, rules-based international order grounded in realism instead of becoming an ever-shrinking club of like-minded countries. This is the core message of the report. A stronger Europe begins with us, our decisions, our vision, and our unwavering commitment to a shared future. I look forward to hearing your perspectives and collaborating to achieve our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dora. Now we come to the statement by Mr. Marko, the President of the European Court of Human Rights. I welcome him to our Assembly, and Mr. Bosniak, you have the floor.
Dear President Ursopoulos, dear Secretary General Hasivatsiliou, honorable members of the Parliamentary Assembly, dear ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the European Convention on Human Rights, a cornerstone of the Council of Europe's protection of human rights and global human rights architecture. We have come a long way from the time when here, in the Parliamentary Assembly, the idea of the Convention was born and brought to life. Through the Court's interpretation of it as a living instrument, the Convention now applies to situations that were unforeseeable and unimaginable at the time when it was adopted, including issues related to new technologies, bioethics, or climate change. This shows that the Convention can safeguard human rights and address any challenges in a rapidly changing world. Recently, those changes include threats to the rule of law. This is why today I wish to address you on the unique and essential role of the Court in safeguarding, promoting, and inspiring the international order based on the rule of law in Europe and beyond. The Convention is imbued with the principle of the rule of law, which is inherent in all its articles, making it a rule of law instrument. Guided by the principle as a lodestar in its interpretation of the Convention, the Court has reinforced the importance of the rule of law in numerous cases, such as those concerning extraordinary renditions, or in cases of democratic backsliding, such as those concerning judicial reform in Poland. These examples show that in upholding the rule of law, the Court must often work in tandem with the Parliamentary Assembly, other Council of Europe institutions, the EU, and other international organizations. That requires interpreting the Convention in harmony with other international instruments. Thus, the Court has consistently held that the Convention cannot be interpreted and applied without taking into account relevant rules and principles of international law. For instance, in last year's landmark case of Ukraine versus Russia, Crimea, the Court interpreted the Convention in light of international humanitarian law, finding the application of Russian law in Crimea unlawful under the Convention. This approach, which fosters a harmonious interpretation of international law and prevents its fragmentation, is not a one-way street. Other relevant international instruments and other sources of international law need to be interpreted and applied in harmony with the Convention. For example, the Court has held that UN Security Council resolutions should be interpreted with the presumption that the Security Council did not intend to impose obligations violating human rights. This is how the Court injects the rule of law into the bloodstream of international law. Being one of the international courts most frequently called upon, and a global standard setter in human rights protection, it should therefore not come as a surprise that the crucial inspiration for recent judgment on climate change by the South Korean Constitutional Court was our Verein Klima Seniorin and Schweiz judgment, which will certainly continue to resonate globally and will undoubtedly have an influence on the International Court of Justice, in its climate case. In recent years, a key example of the Court's commitment to the rules-based international order has been its ability to deal with the unprecedented number of conflict-related cases. Through the exercise of its residual jurisdiction, the Court is currently the only forum in the world holding the Russian Federation accountable for its human rights violations. This shows that the court does not succumb to the old Latin dictum inter arma silent leges, in times of war the laws fall silent. Instead, it demonstrates the importance of the possibility to successfully litigate, even in such times, and underscores the court's role of judicial arm of the Council of Europe, which is there not only to prevent the war, but also to tame it. Because of its special contribution to peace and international understanding, the court was this year awarded the Dresden International Peace Prize, which I will have the honor to accept on behalf of the court this February.
Ladies and gentlemen,
harmonious interpretation
of international law and the effective functioning of the convention system based on shared responsibility both require judicial dialogue and knowledge sharing. Key pillars for such exchanges within the convention system are requests for advisory opinions under Protocol number 16, our knowledge sharing platform and our superior courts network, which does not only include courts from Council of Europe member states, but also 3 regional observer courts: the Court of Justice of the European Union and the 2 regional human rights courts, the Inter-American and African courts. In December of 2024, the Supreme Court of Canada expressed its interest in becoming an observer court, and most recently, in fact just last week, the Supreme Court of Mexico also expressed its wish to join the network. This shows that our judicial dialogue extends beyond Europe. In 2018, the court, along with the 2 other regional courts, adopted the San Jose Declaration and established the Permanent Forum for Institutional Dialogue, which meets every 2 years. The court also engages in dialogue with United Nations bodies. Last year, meetings were held with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the President of the UN International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals. This year, a delegation from the court will visit the International Court of Justice in The Hague and will also receive a visit from the Human Rights Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a need to both renew and reinvigorate the rules-based international order. The court will continue to play its part, as it has so far, but further strengthening the court's bilateral and multilateral relations and dialogue beyond Europe requires resources. What is more, the court's legitimacy in safeguarding the rule of law and promoting it beyond Europe depends on the effective implementation of its judgments, for which it needs cooperation and support from the Council of Europe and its institutions. The Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly has a powerful role to play, and you are already doing a great deal in this respect, for which I am very grateful. When it comes to recommitting to the Convention, the Reykjavik Declaration invited you to strengthen political dialogue with your respective national interlocutors on the implementation of our judgments. You are the political driving force behind the organization, as well as the political guardian of human rights and democracy. You speak on behalf of 675 million Europeans, and thanks to your dual role as members of the Parliamentary Assembly, as well as national parliaments, you have the opportunity to inform, decide, influence, and enlighten people as to the vital work of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, both here in Strasbourg and at home in your national capitals. The value of your work to enhance cooperation between national and international tiers of government and helping us to understand each other better cannot be underestimated. I therefore call for and count on your renewed support. To conclude, I join your wish, President Rousopoulos, that this year the rule of law will prevail over the rule of force, which reflects the vision of our founders, namely to place international law above the power of arms and to put the might of the law ahead of the law of the mighty. Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members of this esteemed assembly, I assure you that the court will play its part so that this indeed happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I will now open the list of speakers and I will call Mrs. Elisaveta Iasko on behalf of the EPP group to take the floor. Elisaveta.
Hello, dear yes, it's working. Dear colleagues, let me congratulate our rapporteur on raising this incredibly timely, important topic. All of us, we need an absolute rethinking of international order. And as it's rightly said in the report, we have unprecedented challenges for different international organizations. I don't need to name them. They are all in the report. But what do we see now? We see that some of these organizations, including United Nations, ICRC, and many others, are going through crises internally of not being able to deliver their work, but also certain distrust that is coming from the society. We're working here on a number of initiatives of restoring actually trust in this organization, but we need to be very honest that these organizations need reforms. They need to have the mechanisms and everything possible to face and address the challenges that we currently have. I will not be opening your eyes by saying that unfortunately, some of these organizations, because of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, are not able to deliver their standard functions, unfortunately. Which means what? We need to make sure that the next years we in this assembly create not only a platform but a good example of how we can work together to create that mechanisms that would matter. And we do have a number of mechanisms that we already created. Just want to name that the register of damage, the compensation mechanism that we voted in this assembly, and then in UN we also had a vote. It created an important, very important pillar for justice for future. It gives a lot of Ukrainians a big hope that one day we finally will have justice. And there are many more opportunities that we can use now to create platforms for the facilitation of the exchange of the prisoners of war, of civilians, of children, on all that humanitarian functions that UN and other organizations actually do have in their mandate. We need to make sure that these functions are restored, but with the current real challenges addresses, not with the ones that were 70, 80 years ago, but the ones that exist right now. And I really hope that next session we will be again reflecting on what we did in this period. And I just want to wish that we don't stop on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisaveta. On behalf of the European Conservatives and Patriots, Mr. Zsolt-Nemet. Zsolt, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, Secretary General, dear Dora, congratulations to this important report. I think we know that we need to look outside the Council of Europe, and we need to look outside Europe under the present global circumstances. Our attention every day is focusing today on Washington, D.C. What's happening there? And I think this report is extremely important from this perspective. It helps for us to look outside Europe, and I'm glad we have this report in front of us. I would like to congratulate the President of the European Court. We have two important guiding lines when we talk about international law. The European Convention on Human Rights, important what we have heard from the President. I think it was important to listen to him in this hemicycle, and it would be useful to do that exercise in the future more often. And the other one is the UN Charter. And as my previous speaker said, the UN is in a serious crisis because the Security Council doesn't work. And now I think we need to pay attention to the UN. What's going to happen with the UN in the future? How the international actors, how America, how Europe, how the Council of Europe will act. I think our office in New York would be very important, as the recommendation suggests, to put in place our New York office of the Council of Europe. But the values of the UN are important, and the values, the founding values of the UN Charter are valid. And I think it's important that our rapporteur was focusing on this, and it's important that the new American administration is reinforcing the fundamental values of the UN. So I think the peace in the Ukraine and the war of the aggression of Russia is coming closer. The rule of law instead of the rule of force is coming closer. This is a fundamental value. The new concept of security vis-à-vis migration, for example, is coming closer. The new and classical understanding of human rights, conservative understanding of basic human rights, the non-interference, the sovereign equality of nations is coming also close. A new form of Atlanticism, and it was reflected in the report, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and finally, a global responsibility, the global good, paying attention to the global south. However, I may not share the differentialization in the report of global east and global south. The global east and the global south is quite close to each other. But anyway, I think the most important message of the report is that we need unity, unity inside Europe, unity inside the West, and an engagement with the external world, especially with the global South. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President of the Conservatives Group. And now I give the floor to Madame Larissa Bilozir on behalf of ALDE. Larissa. Have you inserted your badge? Have you inserted your badge first? Okay, just press the button and wait for a couple of seconds.
Dear Mr. President, dear fellow colleagues, I want to express my gratitude on the behalf of ALDE Group to the rapporteur for addressing the need to uphold the rules-based international order that lies in the heart of preserving peace, security, and stability, particularly when its principles under constant threat. The war in Ukraine underscores this urgency. Russia assaults its principles upon the UN Council of Europe were founded by destroying people's lives, by destroying our sovereign countries, killing civilians, abducting people, children, and daily bombing houses, maternity hospitals, the nursery houses for the elderly people. Russia invaded Ukraine, systematically deportates over 40,000 children annually. Can you imagine now those children that lived in occupied Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk regions are forced to fight in the Russian army against their motherhood, with high readiness to fight against West if needed. Impunity is dangerous, and Russia already replaced international law with a rule of force. While the UN fails to combat this violation, Russia's appetites are growing each day. I also want to remind you that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, did not participate in a World Peace Summit in Switzerland. Instead, he went to Russia for the BRICS Summit, met with the war criminal Putin, shake his hands. Such steps of the UN Secretary General do not contribute to peace. I want to remind you that Russia didn't go through the procedure of the UN Statute Charter. It illegally occupied the Soviet Union place in the Council that doesn't let the UN to take decisive steps, and Russia uses its position to shield itself from accountability. Dear colleagues, it's high time we demonstrate our unity. We have to ensure adherence to international law, create special tribunal for the crime of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, support the work of International Criminal Court, and uphold the ruling of the International Court of Justice. It is important to reconsider the membership of Russia that violates international law by invading sovereign state, and to reconsider the use of the veto power by permanent members. Believe me, colleagues, Ukraine, like no other nations, understands the importance of raising the Council's global influence, as well as the cost of inaction. Let us choose action. Let us choose reform. Let us choose a future rooted in justice, accountability, and rules. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Madame Bilozir. And now,
Merci.
left.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's resolution is very timely, but I believe we need to speak clearly. We live in a multipolar world with multiple crises and huge inequalities. And Mr. Trump, after his re-election, tells us that in this world, where authoritarian regimes are becoming stronger, it is not in the interests of the United States to agree new, more inclusive rules based on international law as it did in 1945 or 1990, but to replace these rules with one rule: might makes right. The United States will act to its immediate benefit, even if that means not respecting borders, the internal affairs of state and international organizations. And politics will be based on the power not of politicians, but of billionaires who became richer during the economic crisis, the wars, and the pandemic. As Hannah Arendt said of imperialism, businessmen became politicians, and politicians were only taken seriously when they spoke like businessmen. All this, however, did not come out of nowhere. The rise of far-right populism is based on the contradictions of neoliberal globalization that led to a global economic crisis and huge inequalities. It is based on the fact that there was no fair transition to the green agenda, and the costs were paid by consumers while big companies became richer. It is based on our double standards when we rightly condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but are afraid to speak about thousands of deaths by Israel in Palestine. And we are afraid to talk about peace in Ukraine and let Mr. Trump and Mr. Orban speak about it first. It is based on the hypocrisy of those who wanted foreign workers but are unwilling to support their rights, who supported wars but are unwilling to accept refugees. We see today the shameful images of the violent deportation of people who have lived for decades in the United States. So what we need today, I think, is a broad coalition of governments, movements, and citizens a European alliance of democracy and justice that promotes our values while having learned the lessons of the last 30 years. The Council of Europe must send the message that we accept a new multipolar world in which the West will have a strong role without dominating, that we want together with the UN and EU and regional organizations from around the world to discuss a new international architecture on the basis of the United Nations Charter, and that our relationship with the United States can only be based on mutual respect, respect for our borders, and the clear message that we will not accept interference in our political systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tsipras. On behalf of the Socialists, Greens and Democrats, I call Marietta Karamanli. Madame Karamanli.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Rapporteur. Dear colleagues, I should like first of all to thank Ms. Bakoyannis, the rapporteur, for this work, which is very timely in an uncertain period, balanced because it reminds us of the importance of law, and which puts in proper perspective accepting shared rules, a vector of multilateralism, and the efforts of the United Nations to improve the acceptability of international bodies seen as platforms of international relations. The United Nations, just like our own assembly, are by their very nature institutions which go above and beyond national or regional interests. The rapporteur recalls, moreover, and very correctly, the need for greater work being done with our partner, the United Nations, so as to strengthen rule-based multilateralism. I should like to make three further remarks. First of all, I had the pleasure and also the responsibility as chair of the Subcommittee on Foreign Relations of our Assembly with the chair of the Committee for Democracy and Political Affairs in November 2024 to be part of a delegation of our Assembly carrying out many interviews at UN headquarters with representatives of that body. The subjects we tackled were many: peacekeeping, the fight against terrorism, human rights, and economic development, inter alia. It's quite clear today there is a democratic offensive that needs to be carried out so as to defend and promote multilateralism, understood as being countries coming together so as to find pacific solutions to their differences and to pursue common goals. On the one hand, multilateralism has concrete results which we need to make better known. I would wish that our Assembly support initiatives going in the direction of greater ownership of those successes by national parliaments. On the other hand, UN bodies should be more inclusive of the diversity of the different countries and regions that make up our world, and this is important work which is underway. In parallel to the UN, the Council of Europe and our Assembly have a culture of human rights and of peace, and on this last point I should like within our group to emphasize this priority, which we need to hold high so that sustainable peace will give greater results for each and every one of us in an increasingly interdependent world, not simply in terms of economic and human exchanges, but also the scientific and social challenges that our world must confront in a context of climate change and sustainable development. Here we're talking about culture and ideas which should be shared and commitments to be carried out. The recognition of the Council of Europe as a regional organization, strengthening of links between our Secretary General and that of the United Nations, the presence of a delegation also brought out in the report are elements which will allow us to make our culture and advantages better understood. The Socialist Democratic and Green Group, who I'm representing today in this debate, supports this report and will vote for it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madame Karamanli. And with Madame Karamanli, we have closed the first round of the representatives of the parties. I open now the list and I give the floor to Petra Bayer. Dear Petra, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Theodoros, Mr. President of the Court, Mr. Bošnjak. The UN framework for sustainable future, the Sustainable Development Goals, in their Goal 16, focus on strong institutions, including the access to justice, which is key in institutions, but also key to meet all the other goals. Also, the Pact of the Future of the UN is clear on this, and well-functioning courts are substantial in this regard. Knowing other international courts and how they are composed and how the judges are selected, I think I can say that the democratic standards we follow when we elect the judges for the European Court of Human Rights are very high. We have a saying in Austria, the good is the enemy of the better. So it's always possible to improve what you are doing, even if it's already good. And I would like to take the chance to tell you that the Committee for the Election of Judges is not only hearing, interviewing the judges and then make recommendations to the plenary whom you should vote, and we of course hope that you follow our suggestions. We are also working on the improvement of this election procedure, and I'm very grateful for the openness of all the important stakeholders, to their openness to debate with us and to exchange and identify where we should turn screws to in our proceeding to even become better. So can tell that we just this morning had an exchange with the President and the Bureau of the Court, and it was indeed very fruitful, and we decided to continue because there is still a lot to debate. So thank you once more, Mr. President Bošnjak. We also have had exchanges with former judges, with the panel of experts from the Committee of Ministers who screens the lists and the CVs beforehand, and we will have many more debates with other important stakeholders. As Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, we have an important role in upholding and renew a well-functioning rule-based international order, and I think that we really should take this opportunity by guaranteeing an effective European Court of Human Rights, and also to work on the implementation of its sentences on the national level, because both a well-functioning court and a well-functioning implementation of its decisions is substantial on the one hand in the trust in the Convention, and of course also to the protection of the human rights of all citizens from all our constituencies and countries, and I'm happy that we have the opportunity to make it better than we already do it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra. Haik Mameganyan is next.
President, ladies and gentlemen, all the countries in the world, all the nations have to pay a price for the new world order to be established. Armenians paid that price in the beginning of the 20th century by facing a genocide in the Ottoman Empire. Afterwards, we paid that price by the victims of more than 300,000 of our soldiers who fought the Nazis. It was for the previous world order. Unfortunately, we have already paid a very high price for the new world order as well. We paid that price in 2020 by facing the Azerbaijani aggression, and we faced that price by the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. It is too high price for our nation. Well, all of us are legislators here, and we do know that the core, that the center of the law is the people, the human being who believes in the strength of that law. Well, people in Nagorno-Karabakh believed in the international law. Unfortunately, they were fooled. They were betrayed by the current Armenian government and by the world, and they were left alone with the dictators. The world must not let the story to be repeated. The new world order must be based on values and rules, not on the oil and geopolitical interests. Well, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I do believe that I'm not the only one. There is no rule in the world that says that it's okay for the Armenians to be humiliated and imprisoned in Baku. There is no rule in the world that says that it's okay for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, for the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, to be forcefully moved away from their homeland. There is no rule that there is okay, that says that it's okay to live each day under the danger of aggression from Azerbaijan, under the threats of the dictator of Azerbaijan. So we, the Armenians, are the gatekeepers of the Christian world. We shouldn't be left alone. And please believe, we do need the help and the support of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Heik. Victoria Tiblum is next.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. This report concerns the urgent need for the world to counteract the current erosions as regards to our long-standing international rules. Rules for how we should deal with each other as countries. For example, how we shape our foreign policies in order to preserve and strengthen peace, or our efforts to expand our trade to make it available and fair to all parties. Simplified, how we go about making this a better rather than a worse world in which to live. The Council of Europe has made an outstanding contribution to strengthening rule-based multilateralism by promoting democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and contributing to creating a single European legal space. But the wear and tear of time is always there. It puts under strain both international rules as such and the institutions there to uphold them. By way of example, a former Council of Europe member country, Russia, has over the past 3 years been breaching a founding principle of ours and of international law, namely the invasion of another country, indeed accompanied by the wholesale killing of the civilian population. This is an utter and total violation of international law. The need for a renewed rule-based international order arises from the failure of the current multilateral framework to effectively address and advance the broader interests of humanity. The world is currently facing the highest number of conflicts since the end of the Second World War, and the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, is struggling to fulfill its primary responsibility of ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security due to the irreconcilable positions and interests of its permanent members. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Victoria. Claude Kern, you're next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président de la Cour.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I should like to congratulate our colleague Dora Bakoyannis for her report, which paints a very thorough picture of the challenges and risks linked to the current disorder in the international order. Challenging the rule of law and the rise in nationalism in the world, which has had terrible consequences, has shown that the United Nations has not been in a position to put an end to the conflict in the Middle East. We are seeing a fractured world. We're seeing the emergence of new powers which do not necessarily share our values and certainly wish to brutally call them into question. And this report shares a vision of an international order which is based on rules as well as respect for international law. In this process, the Council of Europe is absolutely vital. Indeed, our organization has been able to share its underlying values with countries of Eastern Europe and those that emerged following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And conventions have been signed by a number of third countries, which is the case of the Istanbul Convention, which has been signed by both Tunisia and Jordan. And last but not least, the case law of the European Court of Human Rights plays a huge role in upholding the values which are espoused by the Council of Europe in all of our member states. We must therefore continue to push forward the work of our organization and uphold the international order. I would like the Council of Europe, therefore, to be recognized as a regional order within the meaning of the United Nations Charter. It goes without saying that we must strive to institute dialogue with all competent authorities to renew international dialogue based on the rule of law. At the same time, we have to see to it that we have sufficient resources when it comes to security and defense, and also to try and counter foreign interference in democratic processes. The election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United Nations and his repeated criticisms of NATO mean that we now have to shoulder our responsibility when it comes to defense. Negotiations are currently underway within the European Union to try and roll out the European defence industry and also to have joint defence procurement. And we have demonstrated our willingness to be proactive in order to reaffirm the strategic autonomy of the EU. Reaffirming your values also means that you have to be capable of defending yourself independently. We need to secure our electoral processes to fight against disinformation and the manipulation of information or results, and we have to follow up the various resolutions we've already adopted to this end. Thank you.
Yunus Emre is next.
Thank you, Mr. President. The functioning of a rule-based international relations system is of significant importance, particularly when reflecting on past conflicts and experiences. Therefore, I would like to extend my gratitude to the rapporteur and all those who contributed to the report. At the same time, I believe we must critically examine the rule-based approach to international relations. While such a system can help organize global affairs, it can also normalize power imbalances under the guise of rules. These rules may ultimately protect the long-term interests of the powerful. Thus, rather than focusing solely on the existence of rules, we must assess how effectively these rules promote justice. Even in the most oppressive systems, rules and authority exist. What truly matters is whether those rules serve justice. Furthermore, we should reconsider the view of multipolarity as a problem. There are a number of references to the shift towards multipolarity in the report. Multipolarity is not inherently less stable than unipolarity or bipolarity. The issues raised in the report, such as authoritarianism, isolationism, unilateralism, extreme nationalism, are not the result of the shift towards multipolarity or presence or absence of rules and rule-based system. Rather, they stem from the failure of these rules to be perceived as just. Dear colleagues, the discussion naturally leads us to the United Nations. When we reflect on the state of anarchy that prevails in the interstate relations before the UN, it is important to acknowledge that, despite its shortcomings, the UN marked a significant step forward. Compared to the failure of the League of Nations, the UN's inclusivity and longevity stand out. However, a pressing question remains. What relevance does being on the winning side of World War II have in addressing today's practical challenges? We all recognize that this distinction is no longer meaningful, and that in itself is the problem. The question of why 5 permanent members of the Security Council hold veto power remains unanswered for billions of people in Africa, Islamic world, and Latin America. Given the international law principle of sovereign equality of states, this question is also more significant. Finally, in discussions about abnormalities in international relations, there is often a focus on extremism outside of Europe. While this is a valid observation, the real issue today lies within Europe, the very birthplace of democratic values. The rise of anti-democratic movements and extremism within Europe challenges these values. As parliamentarians, we are also democracy activists. We have a vital role to play in addressing these issues. Thank you very much.
Alain Milon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President of the European Court of Human Rights, dear colleagues. I would like, first of all, obviously, to thank our colleague Dora for her report, which sheds light on the outlook for multilateralism and possible developments in the international order at a point in time when the rules of international governance that were set up at the end of the Second World War are being called into question. In fact, at the end of the last century, following the fall of the Soviet Union, the world was dominated by one single great power, the United States. Countries promoting democracy and the respect of human rights were models to be imitated, and the Council of Europe had many countries join, and those new member countries expressing the wish to share those values. Today, new great powers have emerged on the economic level, and they wish to play a role in managing the world's affairs. It's obviously the case for China, but also India or Brazil. In parallel, Russia wishes once again to declare itself to be a great power and shows large hostility to democratic Europe. As to the United States, they have become very unpredictable, and under the renewed presidency of Donald Trump are calling into question many rules or institutions in the international order, as we can see from their decision to leave the World Health Organization or the blockage the World Trade Organization has been experiencing for years now. Given the situation, we need to promote a fairer world based on the rule of law so as to avoid that the simple strength be the only criterion for existing in the world. This is the case for the creation of the Council of Europe, but also the European Union, and for those countries that are members of them. We have chosen to share our values and our rule of law, and particularly a demanding vision of human rights. The values that we defend here should remain our compass so as to carry out a demanding dialogue with other regions of the world. And in order to do this, it's necessary that these values continue to be cherished by the member states of our organization, by all the member states of our organization, including, and I would like to emphasize this, by respecting the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. The values which we defend here, which have universal value, need to be reiterated with force. When I see what is going on in Azerbaijan or in Georgia, I can only be deeply concerned. The new leap forward that we expected after the Reykjavik summit was unfortunately not enough to counter the difficulties which we are seeing and which are casting doubt on multilateralism. That's why we need to be committed. Thank you very much.
Mariam Geka, you are next.
Thank you. Dear President and colleagues, it's an honor to address this Assembly on the urgent need for a renewed, equitable and inclusive international order. From the outset, the architects of the post-World War II international order operated under a perception of superiority, particularly certain Western states positioning themselves as rule makers while excluding much of the world from meaningful participation. How can we build a world where peace, justice and prosperity are not privileges for the few, but rights for all? Today's global challenges require urgent and resolute action. From Ukraine to Gaza, Sudan to Yemen and Syria to Lebanon, the wounds of conflict all over the world reveal a harsh reality. The international order designed to champion justice and peace often failed as a silent witness or, at times, even as a complicit architect, leaving countless lives shattered and unprotected. Syria stands as a nation marked by 13 years of relentless conflict, where nearly 1 million lives have been lost, half the population forced to become refugees, and countless survivors endure unimaginable suffering. Where was the international community when torture echoed through the prison walls? Israel's genocide in Gaza also stands as a stark reminder of the failures of the international community. Is it possible to justify the unjustifiable? Now we see that 96% of the population faces severe malnutrition. Did it really take the massacre of 50,000 people and the conscience of humanity protesting worldwide for a long overdue ceasefire to be announced? To allow these crimes to go unchallenged is to undermine the very principles upon which the rules-based system was built. The dysfunction and silence of international actors in these crises highlight the significance of President Erdogan's statement. The world is bigger than 5, and a fairer world is possible. This is not just a critique of the UN Security Council, but a call for reforming international institutions to be more democratic, inclusive, and effective. A Security Council paralyzed by the political and ideological interests of a few veto powers cannot serve as a guardian of global peace and stability in today's world. From hosting millions of refugees to brokering the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Turkey has shown that leadership is about creating pathways to sustainable peace. The crisis in Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond demands a system that prioritizes the rights of the oppressed over the interests of the powerful. As we confront these crises, let us commit to building a system rooted in justice, humanity, and equality. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention. Madame Bartos.
Thank you. Ms. Bartos has the floor.
Madam President, thank you for the floor. In one of his statements, Mr. Secretary General said that one of the most important common concerns of the Council of Europe and the UN is the maintenance of international peace and security. Indeed, this is the mission of all international organizations, to create a framework for the well-being of humanity on the basis of international law or through multilateralism. However, the world has changed since the creation of international organizations, so they need to be reformed. Thank you for the rapporteur for reviewing the process so far, drawing conclusions and making suggestions. Thank you for your work. I would like to reflect for a few points. The UN is the key partner of the Council of Europe and the ideal platform for global engagement. It is important to further deepen the cooperation between the two organizations. The cooperation between the United Nations and the Council of Europe holds exceptional importance, as these are united by the shared commitment to universal values and principles, which is vital in the face of today's increasingly complex and growing geopolitical challenges. In particular, the risk of polarization of the international community as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which could destroy the existing mechanism of cooperation between East and West, justifies this. Our challenges are interconnected and can only be addressed through multilateralism. The UN must be at the center of this effort and provide a framework for this work. Hungary is convinced that the membership criteria on the UN's main executive body has to be adapted to the 21st century's political and economic realities and shall be guided by the principle of equitable geographical representation. In our opinion, the UN Security Council has all the necessary tools to guarantee international peace and security. However, it is important to bear in mind that this toolkit should not be misused at the expense of the political agenda of some states. Hungary also supports efforts for increasing the effectiveness of the work methods of the Security Council. The Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN member states in 2015 and in which Hungary, as co-chair of the working group, actively participated, is a tool to alleviate or, in the best case, eliminate the problems that are pressing humanity. The UN and the Council of Europe can work closely together to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fassino has the floor. You need to insert your badge, sir, and then push the button.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I shall speak in Italian. I should like to thank Dora Bakoyannis for her report, which is full of important indications that we need to work on. I think we should take as our starting point this idea. We are entering a phase of international anarchy, which is characterized by a deep crisis in multilateralism, a crisis in international institutions, a strong reemergence of autocratic temptations which are casting into doubt democracy and its liberal values. And to this we must add the fact that we have ever more the life of the world today and political decisions that are made influence from non-political actors. Let's think, for instance, about the enormous increase in the intrusion of digital communication in institutional lives, in politics, and in our societies. I think that also the great weight that economic powers that are linked to globalization must be considered. I'm thinking of the fact that in many parts of the world we're seeing nationalist closing off being a tendency, and the idea that each country is thinking now that it can solve the world's problems on the basis of its own individual policies. And I think that these are the things that we need to discuss, that are casting doubt on a democratic multilateral system founded on shared values that has been governing the world up until today. And to this we must add the fact that in some parts of the world, and particularly in the global south, there is an ever more explicit idea that the world can be simply ruled by the West is not going to work. And we need to come to grips with all of this. But there's one basic problem. In 1945, up until now, the world was guided by liberal democratic values that were universally recognized. Well, even the most bloody dictatorships tended to reaffirm that they were Democrats and that they organized fake elections and tried to mask what their own regimes were doing because they couldn't bear the idea of being denounced as anti-democratic or dictators. And those shared values which guided the world up until today are no longer recognized as universal as they were for a long period of time. More and more we see situations in which when people mention the respect of democratic rights and liberal values that Dora Bakoyannis was talking about, the answer is, but yes, those are your values. They aren't ours. And I think that this is the basic problem. Rebuilding, let's say, a shared platform of values on which we can rebuild a governance system for the world. And from that standpoint, the Council of Europe has an important role to play in its relations with the United Nations and other international organizations, but above all because these values that are to be reaffirmed and which we need to rebuild a consensus around throughout the world are our values. And I think that the indications that are brought out in Dora Bakoyannis' report cover exactly this, and this is what we need to work on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Dinnick, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, at this critical moment in history, when we face the rising tides of conflict, instability, and geopolitical tension, it is more important than ever to reaffirm our commitment to international law. This is not just a matter of principle, but of practical in society. If we are to reverse the negative trends we see today, we must act decisively A renewed commitment to international law, coupled with bold reforms to the multilateral system, is the only path forward. The rule of law serves as the bedrock for peace and cooperation between nations, and we must work collectively to ensure that it is upheld in every corner of the globe. I agree with the reporter. It is clear that the current structure of international rule-based order, with its outdated power dynamics and imbalances, is inadequate for addressing today's complex global challenges. As suggested in the report, we must advocate for a more inclusive and representative institutions that better reflect the realities of the 21st century, where all nations, large and small, have a voice in the decisions that shape our shared future. Reforming the international political, financial, and economic institutions must remain a priority, ensuring they serve the interests of all nations and not just a select few. At the same time, we must continue to stand firm and defend the values that define Europe's commitments to peace, justice, and equality, where Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights should also in the future provide rule. With this in mind, I would particularly like to welcome today's address of the President of the Court of Human Rights. To address the rising conflicts across the globe, we must not only work to reform existing structures, but also seek new avenues for cooperation, including the strengthening of regional diplomatic challenge of creating stronger platforms for dialogue, building confidence between nations, preventing the escalation of disputes, and investing in sustainable peace. Our action must stay our priorities. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Mr. Tan, you have the floor.
Monsieur Tan.
Mr. Tan.
Vous avez la parole.
From Turkey, you have the floor.
Vous devez insérer votre badge.
You'll need to insert your badge.
Chair, honorable members of the Parliamentary Assembly, the world is facing a profound transformation. Economic inequalities, shifting power dynamics, climate change, and persistent conflicts are straining the very foundations of the global system. At a time when multilateral cooperation is more essential than ever, we are instead witnessing growing fragmentation and a worrying reliance on unilateral measures. The use of unilateral sanctions exemplifies this troubling trend. While sanctions are often justified as tools to enforce international law or promote human rights, too often they reflect the interests of the powerful rather than the principles of justice. They bypass multilateral institutions, disregards the sovereignty of states, and can have devastating consequences for innocent civilians. Unilateral sanctions may create a system where might makes right, where economic and political power can dictate global norms without accountability. If we allow this trend to continue, we risk undermining the very values this Assembly upholds. No country, no matter how powerful, should have the unchecked authority to act as both judge and executioner. To this end, we must strengthen the multilateral mechanisms that were established to ensure fairness and collective decision-making. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and our Council must be revitalized and reformed to reflect contemporary realities. Their credibility depends on their ability to enforce rules impartially and equitably. We must also foster greater dialogue and diplomacy as alternatives to coercion. Instead of sanctions, let us prioritize mediation and confidence-building measures. Instead of unilateralism, let's embrace inclusive approaches that ensure even the smallest nations have a seat at the table. Dear colleagues, this is not just a plea for fairness, it's a call to action. The world is watching, and our citizens expect us to rise above narrow interests and lead with vision. If we are to secure a peaceful, prosperous future for the next generation, we must reaffirm our collective commitment to an inclusive, just, and resilient international order. Let us ensure that fairness, justice, and multilateralism are not mere words in documents, but the guiding light for our actions. Let us work together to rebuild trust, re-establish legitimacy, and renew our shared commitment to the values that unite us all. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Ms. Dallos from France, you have the floor.
Madame
President, Rapporteur, thank you very much indeed for your report. Dear colleagues, 80 years on from the setting up of the United Nations and the Council of Europe, the multilateral system for global governance was put in place in the wake of the Second World War to consolidate peace is under threat. International relations are unfolding in an increasingly polarized environment, and we are now witnessing the rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, isolationism, as well as a flexing of muscles. The number of conflicts has reached record levels. Against this kind of backdrop of heightened tensions, there is, of course, a tendency to seek to withdraw, which, whilst it is understandable, would turn out to be completely counterproductive. In the same way as algorithms on social networks end up trapping their users in echo chambers, geopolitical isolationism would end up compartmentalizing countries into select, hermetically sealed geopolitical groups which would be pitted against each other. The solution, therefore, lies not in rejecting others, but quite the opposite, by a policy of opening up to others. On the 22nd of September 2024, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution designed to adjust some of its rules to the international order. Amongst the measures that were suggested was to expand the membership of the UN Security Council in order to increase its representativeness, to change the rules on the use of the veto by permanent members, and to not allow them to continue to block a certain number of decisions. And I believe that we, as a Council of Europe, have a crucial role to play in this process. We can reassert more firmly our position and our weight within European and international organizations. Recognizing the Council of Europe as a regional organization within the meaning of Article 52 of the United Nations Charter, I believe, is patently obvious. And setting up a Council of Europe office at UN headquarters is something that could be envisaged as long as the financial ramifications are limited. We should also step up dialogue between the European Court of Human Rights and the International Court of Justice. I believe that that is a very wise proposal. Member states of the Council of Europe, which are also members of the EU, obviously have a special role to play at EU level. And we should, of course, speed up enlargement. But at the same time, we should be careful and make sure that we can actually take in members. We don't need to break the momentum. Rather, it is by increasing exchanges and dialogue that the Council of Europe can work to defend democracy, human rights and the rule of law and make its contribution to the emergence of a renewed and consolidated international order. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Goncharenko, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame le Président. Dear friends, we're speaking about international order, rule-based international order. Let us be frank, rule-based international order does not exist anymore. That is the true, that is the real situation today. We can try to be blind on this, but this will not help us. Because it is destroyed by Russia, by its aggression, it is destroyed by their regimes, and we can just say a lot of words, but the words doesn't work today. We need actions. Europe should be really strong, really strong. We have said a million of words during the last 2 days. I haven't heard one word, Greenland. And we need to say this word, Greenland. Let us say about elephant in the room. And we should be with Denmark and Greenland people, whatever they will decide. That's up to them what to do. But we should say clearly, we are with you. Un pour tous, tous pour un. One for all for one. That is the moment, and we need to be clear about this. In other case, nobody will respect us. Nobody will respect our resolutions. It's just a piece of paper, nothing else. It should be missiles under this. It should be army under this. What made Europe great? It was great military power. Great military power of European states. Yes, it was a problem too, because these states were fighting with one another. Let us make another step. Let us make common, strong European army, which will be very strong on the world stage, which will never fight with one another, but which will be ready to protect us, our values, all of us. You just watch what's happening. China is making new artificial intelligence, ChatGPT in America. Where is Europe? My question is, where is Europe? We just here saying, making some resolutions and speaking blah, blah, blah. It doesn't work. We need, United States are building the biggest in human history data center. $500 billion. What we are building? Monuments and beautiful resolutions. It's good. But we need to build another things. We need to build data centers. We need to build artificial intelligence. We need to intellect. We need to build a really strong army. That's the most important. Really, very, very strong army. And Ukrainian army can be one of the bases. And let us build around. And let us be so strong that we will be able to protect our history, our resolutions, our views, our rules and our future. In other case, we will remain just in the museums. There will be a story about some people which were very beautiful, with beautiful ideas, with a lot of talking, but in the result who disappear. Europe should not disappear. Europe should be the force #1 in the world, and we can do this together.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker has the floor.
Dear colleagues, you are great, or Europe will be great.
Okay. I would like to start with a comment. You are great not when you call yourself great, when others consider you great. And Europe will be considered as great by others only when we promote with deeds our values and principles. Dear colleagues, as we reflect on this resolution and recommendation, it's crucial to address the assumptions that underline the call for a renewed rules-based international order. While the document rightly identifies the challenges of the increasing global instability, we must question whether the current international system has served the real interests of justice, democracy, and human rights, or whether it merely reinforces the existing power structures. Let us be clear, the rules-based order, as it has been articulated in recent decades, is not an impartial system. It is one that has disproportionately benefited powerful states and multilateral corporations, often at the expense of the Global South, marginalized communities and the environment. It is one where double standards and hypocrisy prevail, as we have most recently seen in relation to the genocide in Gaza. That is why we should not be asking for a renewal of this order. We should be demanding a system rooted in international law and the UN Charter, one that sets as a priority the protection of people's rights over the interests of states and corporations. The resolutions call for the reform of the UN Security Council and the enlargement of its membership is a step in the right direction, but this is not enough. The UN is often paralyzed by the veto power held by its 5 permanent members, which includes major military powers responsible for countless violations of international law. Reforming the Security Council without addressing the fundamental inequality embedded in its structure will not lead to a fairer or more just global order. Furthermore, the resolution speaks of strengthening dialogue with the Global South, but we must ask, how can the Council of Europe, an institution rooted in the values of the European states, effectively assist countries that have historically been excluded from these structures? This dialogue must move beyond symbolic gestures and include real power sharing and redistribution of resources. The global governance systems cannot be merely reformed to accommodate the Global South. It must be fundamentally restructured to ensure that those who have been historically oppressed and marginalized can shape the decisions that impact their lives. Finally, the resolution focuses on the governance of emerging technologies like AI. Is commendable, but without a commitment to global justice and the distribution of power, these technologies will continue to exacerbate inequalities. We cannot allow the same corporate interests that dominate the global economy to dictate the rules on AI and technological regulation. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention. Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you. Mr. Bergeron has the floor. Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, I was listening to Mr. Goncharenko talking about Greenland a few moments ago, and I would ask my colleagues to also think about Canada, concerning which the new President of the United States seems to have some plans. Our far-sighted and concise report from Ms. Bakoyana shows us that a new world order is surely coming into place. After the Second World War, a bipolar geopolitical system was imposed. After the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, a unipolar system dominated by the United States took the forefront. And today we are dealing with a multipolar world. In this new reality, one axis of authoritarian powers, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, seems to have set themselves the goal to overturn international order based on rules, which constitutes the cornerstone of the multilateral system that our world has used for more than 80 years. Trampling underfoot individual rights, showing contempt for the concepts of sovereignty and states' territorial integrity, these disruptive powers are trying to discredit democratic institutions and are inspiring copycats as well. And some democracies are mutating into authoritarian regimes carrying a small democratic varnish. I call these countries dictatorships. And I think this is something that is beginning to happen in the United States as well. I think it's very dangerous for the planet's democracy to see the new American president and his entourage apparently having their sights on this. But are we not simply reaping the fruits here of our policy of double standards in issues of international law and a reticence to reform international institutions, which have brought about a corrosive narrative which has been patiently fed by this authoritarian axis, saying that we are moralizing hypocrites that are still driven by a colonial mentality. But is it possible to reverse this trend? I'm afraid that will only be possible if we recognize the fault lines and the inequalities that stem from this rule-based international order, and that we are ready to forego some of our privileges in order to remedy the situation. If we don't do this, I fear that the resentment of the global South will go on increasing, and that we will simply see more countries attracted by the siren sound of the authoritarian axis. Our report emphasizes the Pact for the Future of the United Nations, which particularly proposes a reform of the UN Security Council and of international financial architecture. In conclusion, please allow me to share with you an anecdote that one of my Canadian colleagues told me. During a meeting with an opposite number from a developing country, this colleague heard said that when the Chinese come to visit us, they offer us a port, and all you offer us are sermons. I think that says quite a lot. If we want to preserve our rule-based international order that we cherish so greatly, it is time for us to act. Simply, words are not enough. Thank you for your attention.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Kravchuk has the floor.
Merci, Madame le Président. Dear colleagues, dear Ms. Bakoyannis, dear Rapporteur, I think this resolution is actually one of the most important of this session. And look how many people signed for speeches, 60 people. I think it's one of the absolute records for this assembly. And we are discussing a very important issue about the need of renewed rules-based international order. And of course, the war on the European continent that Russia waged against Ukraine is one of the most destabilizing factors in this century. And it is the biggest conflict after the Second World War on this continent, after the United Nations were created. And they were created to avoid such wars. But also, the issue lies not only in the aggression itself, but also in the response, in the way the international organizations respond to this challenge. And organizations that were supposed to be guarantors of the global order have proven powerless in the face of such a challenge. And if the organization created to uphold peace becomes a hostage to a single aggressor, Russian Federation, its structures need an urgent reform. We must immediately review the functioning of the Security Council, and most importantly, the veto power can no longer remain a tool of abuse of an aggressor. It must be strictly regulated. Another critical aspect of this war is global consequences. The energy crisis, food insecurity, economic hardships that hit the most vulnerable countries underscore how connected we all are. Also, we're all closely monitoring the developments in the United States. And of course, European countries should and will develop contacts and strategic partnership with the new administration of United States. But also, it reminds that Europe must be strong itself. United Europe must become a pillar of stability regardless of the political situation across the ocean. The ability to defend ourselves independently is the lesson we have already learned. Dear colleagues, I do believe that democracy is not a weakness, but a strength, but the democracy have to be strong, and the democracy will not waver even in the face of the big challenges. The resolution is a big step forward. It's important to support it. Many thanks for accepting some of the amendments we proposed from a Ukrainian delegation. Some of them were not, and it's a pity that we still think that Russia can be a normal member of United Nations. But I think at the end of the day, the situation will change and the justice will prevail. Thank you so much.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Marie, you have the floor. Thank you, Madam President, colleagues. Allow me to begin with to thank our colleague Dora Bakoyannis for her report, and I share most of its conclusions. The international order and multilateralism today are coming under attack from all sides. First and foremost, by authoritarian regimes challenging the values that we share here and who no longer hesitate to have recourse to force in order to invade neighboring territories. And as I say that, my thoughts go straight away to our Ukrainian colleagues as their soldiers valiantly defend their country in the face of Russian aggression. The international order and multilateralism today are decried, challenged by a growing number of countries referred to often as the Global South. Some of them are being influenced by hostile powers or powers that are hostile to our liberal democratic model, challenging our values and considering them no longer as universal values, but rather as an instrument of undeclared domination. I'm worried, too, when I see the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump joining the camp of those who seek to undermine or disturb the international order. And I worry, too, when there's talk of withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement or the World Health Organization. And I worry, too, when there's talk of appropriating the Panama Canal or Greenland, including by recourse to force, and I worry when there's talk of annexing Canada and making it the state of the U.S., and I worry when migrants are being dubbed as criminals. But what I'm really worried about is the absence of any robust collective response from Europe, as if we were totally stunned, as if our rules-based model were weak and incapable of standing up to these challenges. But it seems to me that that model is neither weak nor incapable of resisting. It can do it, but it needs the political resolve. If we have that political resolve, it's for us as parliamentarians to carry forth that message here and to take it to our respective parliaments, and for those of us who are members of it within the bodies at the level of the European Union. And I share the concerns voiced by Dora when it comes to the current functioning of the United Nations, and she quite rightly underscores the difficulties encountered by the Security Council of the UN, abuse of the right of veto, reduction in peacekeeping forces. The composition of the Security Council has to evolve in order to take into account the disruptions that have affected the world since 1945. There's much criticism of the Security Council, and I think rightly so. Africa needs to be represented. India, Japan, other countries are knocking on the door of the Security Council. So there's much thinking going on the subject. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that a rapid reform of the Security Council, given what that would entail in terms of the procedures, I'm afraid that such a reform would not be immediate. I think we need to strengthen the role of the Council of Europe in the context of European multilateral architecture and global governance. In order to do that, I think the Council of Europe has to fully play its role. Thank you.
Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Bricot.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to congratulate Ms. Bakoyannis for her excellent report, but I need to begin by expressing the regret that this report needs to exist. That's already an admission of failure. It's not total failure, it's not absolute failure, but it is a failure. And what is even more of concern here is that the European continent has already experienced a failure of multilateralism. I should like to quote a former foreign minister, but someone who had many different functions, a great French politician, Aristide Briand, who said in September 1937 before the League of Nations, we are talking about founding world peace on legal order and making this form of international security a legal reality and a physical one. The ideal already existed at that time. Nonetheless, that plan failed. Now, we shouldn't have the project that we have been following since 1945 fail in turn, because we know that the consequence of that will be war. And those consequences are already partially here. Quite a lot has already been said about this, but I would like to come back to 2 points. One is to see that when countries have signed, they must remain faithful. The Paris Agreement is an almost caricatural example of this because they've been signed by President Obama, then President Trump withdrew in 2017, then President Biden went back in 2021, and President Trump withdrew once again last week. So what ongoing nature does the value of an American president's signature have in such contexts? Secondly, with our populations, we need to explain that multilateralism is an effort. It's not something natural. Everyone wants to defend their own country, their own village, their own neighborhood. Multilateralism implies that we also defend one another in an order in which we all agree. And I will conclude by saying, or quoting again Marko, who said, if you live in peace with yourself, you live in peace with the universe. And that's what we would wish for everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Brenner has the floor. Lord Blencathra.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I congratulate the rapporteur on her valiant efforts here, but I regret that the rules-based international order she wishes for here no longer exists. First, there is no single international order. There are multiple international orders. The United Nations and the UN Charter provide a general foundation, but there are a variety of multilateral, but not global institutions that coordinate or regulate members' conduct, providing some limited rule-based order, such as the European Union, the BRICS, the G7, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, OPEC, and of course, we in PACE. I'm afraid the United Nations is a complete failure, and I doubt it will be reformed. At our recent meeting in New York, the Undersecretary for Peacekeeping in South Lebanon said the UN was doing a brilliant job, even though they allowed Hezbollah to build missile stations within a few meters of their UN bases. He said it was everyone else who was at fault for not behaving properly and not the UN. What has the Secretary-General said about the evil Putin regime and their attack on Ukraine? They've allowed the Chinese Communist Party to dictate their policy on the World Health Organization and numerous other world organizations. But let's be honest, colleagues. The rules-based international order we love was invented by the West to boost our trade. In 2000, at the Davos summit, President Clinton said after some anti-globalization process, we will and we must support the rules-based system. The UK minister said there is no alternative to a rules-based system for international trade. And to quote from the Socialist New Statesman magazine, it says, politicians use the rules-based moniker to shield their trade policies from political opposition. Western leaders presented the World Trade Organization not as a neoliberal trade regime, but as an impartial, rules-based one. The idea was to render international trade as an abstract, non-political domain that was best administered by technocrats, a dull and complicated field not of any real concern to the average citizen, end quote. Like it or not, we have no international organization which can stop China from gaining complete military, economic and political superiority and world domination. China is committing genocide against its own people, building the largest military the world has ever seen, infiltrating our universities and institutions, stealing our commercial secrets, threatening its neighbours, and seeking complete domination of all the liberal democratic norms we hold dear. And like it or not, colleagues, the only one who can challenge Chinese domination is not the United Nations, nor the EU, nor any other international rules-based organization, but is the one you all love to hate, and that is President Trump. I dearly hope he will not sell out Ukraine, but I also know that he is the only one at the moment who can defend us from the complete collapse of our international rules, which is the aim of the 4 countries which comprise the new axis of evil: China, North Korea, Russia and Iran. That's not a happy message, not a popular message, but I'm afraid it's a realistic one at the moment. Thank you.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Chailloux, you have the floor. Madam President, President of the European Court of Human Rights colleagues, the report that our colleague Dora Bakeanis has presented is an opportunity to debate the upheavals in our world today, and I thank her for that. And previous speakers have talked about the upheavals in terms of the international order called in question by domination, the emergence of new powers, China, the authoritarian excesses of certain regimes, India, China. the rapid development of a certain number of countries that obviously do not share all our values, all of which calls into question the balances that have governed the world up until now. That fragmentation has gone hand in hand with challenging multilateralism, as we've heard. Institutions supposed to ensure global governance, that's been questioned, including by the United States. And Donald Trump, the apostle of power relations, calling into question a certain number of UN organizations. This is a vision that is diametrically opposed to the vision which we hold dear in Europe, especially here, where we defend a rules-based system and universal human values. The President of the United States has yet again announced that the US would be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. So allow me to stress the importance of sustainable development and the link between human rights and the environment, an area where the Assembly has done much work under the initiative of President Demps. The former president of the French Republic, it is a short formulation saying, "The world is ablaze and we avert our gaze." Now, that expression has never seemed more apposite as the Los Angeles goes up in flames, and the US is calling into question global climate aims. But international cooperation is indispensable if we are to face up to the challenges that global warming brings with it. The adoption by the General Assembly of the UN in September last of the Pact for the Future, in that regard, I think ushers in a glimmer of hope. The pact brings together 56 measures that member states of the United Nations have committed to implement in areas such as sustainable development, international security, or cooperation in the digital sphere. It's important that we can support the implementation of that pact for the future in our various member states. I think it's equally important that we continue our thinking on the link between the environment and human rights in the light of recent case law. As the French Constitutional Council, the European Human Rights Court has introduced in its new climate case law a first reference to future generations, confirming that Article 8 does include a right for individuals to effective protection afforded by state authorities against the serious negative effects that climate change has on their lives. That is an important step. There cannot be an international order without the respect for rules and institutions that are there to ensure that they be applied. So I would underscore the importance that our member states execute the rulings handed down by the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you. Madame Skou, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I congratulate
Le micro, s'il vous plaît. Appuyez sur le bouton.
The microphone, please, if you could press the button.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I congratulate Dora Bakoyannis on this important and well-written report. Bakoyannis explains how the rule-based international order with binding conventions is under pressure by the rise of autocratic regimes with a growing preference for bilateral and nationalistic solutions. More and more we see a world governed by the rule of force and less by the rule of law. Russia and its illegal war of aggression on Ukraine is one example. The horrendous terrorist attack by Hamas and the unproportional use of military force in Gaza by the Netanyahu government are two others. On a different scale, we have member countries deviating from binding conventions, Azerbaijan and Turkey refusing to follow instructions by the European Court of Human Rights to free political prisoners are two examples of this. And since the 20th of January, the new American administration is actively joining this trend. This is contradictory to the values of our organizations, and the result is a more unpredictable and uncertain world for all of us. The Council of Europe was only one of several important international organizations established after the Second World War for states to solve difficulties and to challenges by concerted actions and not through armed conflicts and war. The fundamental idea was to provide platforms for dialogue and cooperation within the frame of democracy and agreed rules. Rules that we today know as human rights, rule of law, international law, humanitarian law, and more. For 80 years, democracy and multilateral cooperation has been the bedrock of our freedom, peace, prosperity, and security in Europe. Let us not lose sight of this and resort to short-sighted and less sustainable solutions. Madam President, I would like to end by reminding us all of the Reykjavik Declaration, where all member states recommitted to the values and principles of the Council of Europe. In the first chapter of the declaration, it says, "We remain determined to strengthen the free and open international order based on the rule of law, respect for the United Nations Charter, the sovereignty and territorial integrity within internationally recognized border of all states, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms." Madam President, our continued commitment to this is more important than ever before, both in Europe and beyond. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci pour votre intervention, Monsieur.
Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Mr. McCleary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to talk today about the challenges facing the rules-based international order and the profound implications for global security and stability. At its core, the rules-based order is a framework of laws, agreements, and institutions established to uphold sovereignty, prevent conflict, and protect fundamental freedoms. It is the system that ensures cooperation triumphs over chaos and fairness supersedes brutal force. However, the order is frail. The rise of authoritarianism and weaponization of economic systems and flagrant violations of international law, such as Russia's unprovoked aggression in Ukraine, tests its resilience. And Ukrainian colleagues should be under no doubt. The UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that should include the seizure of frozen Russian assets held across Europe and the UK. They should be given to Ukraine to support its war and its reconstruction efforts. We face a world where the principles of sovereignty and human rights are under siege and where democratic norms are increasingly disregarded. I speak to you 5 years on from the UK's exit from the EU, the first major shockwave in the destabilisation of the liberal international order. While the vote reflected a democratic decision, its repercussions went far beyond the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. Brexit symbolised a growing shift away from multilateralism and cooperation, emboldening national movements across Europe and beyond. It challenged the notion of shared sovereignty that underpins much of the international rules-based order and signalled retreat from the collaborative frameworks that have historically promoted stability and security. This fragmentation weakened the EU's collective ability to respond to global challenges, from climate change to geopolitical threats like Donald Trump, and marked a turning point in the perceived cohesion of Western democracies. As we grapple with the further strains on the order today, the lessons from Brexit remind us of the costs of disengagement and the need to reinvigorate our commitment to global partnership. That is not just a theoretical debate, but a lived reality. I've seen firsthand the consequences of these challenges through my engagement with the Georgian opposition leaders and NGOs who have spoken passionately about their fight to preserve democracy and their belief in a European future. They look to institutions like the Council of Europe for leadership, and they depend on nations like ours to uphold the principles of fairness and accountability. The strength of the rules-based order lies not in rhetoric, but in our collective ability to enforce its principles. This means holding violators accountable, whether they are state or non-state actors, and addressing the new frontiers of conflict, from digital threats to climate insecurity. It also means adapting multilateral institutions to better represent today's interconnected and interdependent world. The rules-based order is not an abstract ideal, but a lifeline for nations striving for fairness, freedom, and stability. Let us reaffirm our commitment to these principles and ensure that this Council remains a steadfast champion of democracy and the rule of law. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen has the floor.
Thank you very much. Madam President, dear colleagues, as already many of you have mentioned, we stand in a crossroad when it comes to global governance. The rule-based international order established to uphold peace, justice and cooperation is facing unprecedented challenges. We have witnessed, all of us, the tragic consequences of power politics, authoritarianism and unilateralism, such as the war of aggression against Ukraine and also the escalating violence and war in the Middle East. The threats are clear and pressing, and in addition to the military conflicts we face, challenging that transcend borders, climate change, rising inequalities, mass migration and rapid technological advancements. These issues demand collective action. Yet, as we see today, institutions like the United Nations Security Council struggle to function effectively due to divisions among its members. This paralyzes, weakens the very foundations of the international order and threatens the progress of democracy and human rights. Also, the election of Mr. Trump as President of the United States brings great concern about the future for the multinational and multilateral political system. And we certainly know that and feel that at the moment in Denmark and Greenland. The global community must now decide whether to protect and adapt the principles that have sustained us for decades or allow instability to threaten the future of humanity. The Council of Europe has played a pivotal role in advancing democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It has shown that multilateral cooperation is not only possible, but essential. As we align ourselves with the UN resolution Pact for the Future, we must embrace reform and innovation to address today's challenges. A renewed commitment to a rule-based international order is not only desirable, it is necessary. Action is, of course, imperative. We must reform the multilateral system, including an expanded United Nations Security Council that reflects the realities of our diverse world. We must empower underrepresented regions such as Africa and Latin America, ensuring that all voices are heard in decisions that affect us all. Equally important is revisiting international financial institutions, making them fairer and more accessible to developing nations. Moreover, the Council of Europe can take lead in fostering partnerships with the United Nations, particularly in areas like democratic security, conflict prevention and the rule of law. Such cooperation ensures that our efforts to strengthen governance extend beyond Europe to engage with the global South, building on trust and shared responsibility. Only embracing reform and reaffirm our commitment to the values of multilateralism, we can build a future rooted in cooperation and resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Now I call Mr. Wald. Mr. Wald, you have the floor. He's not here. You have the floor.
I might be sitting in the wrong place, I'm sorry. Dear Madam President, this is a timely report, and I applaud the rapporteur for addressing a range of important aspects relating to the future of multilateral cooperation and a rule-based international order. As communicated in the report and addressed in many fora these days, international cooperation as we know it is under pressure. Coming from a small country like Norway, I agree that a rule-based international order is what serves our interests best. This is clearly the best way to secure detent, lasting peace, free world trade, and respect for human rights. Madam President, as we all know, the values of the Council of Europe have been the fundament for the peace and prosperity we have enjoyed in Europe since the Second World War. We should work to not only strengthen them, but also to continue promoting them beyond the borders of Europe and beyond like-minded states. Broad cooperation is absolutely necessary to solve the global problems we face today and for future generations. I hence support to call to renewal of the multilateral system of global governance. Global institutions must become more representative and reflect the world today in a better way than they do now. They should be more transparent and inclusive. I also support the strengthening of the partnership between the Council of Europe and the United Nations. This being said, there is a limit into the depth of multilateral cooperation. In times of emergency, it is entirely natural for political leaders to try to take care of their own population. It is important not to disregard countries' responsibility to put the interest and security of their own people first. I say this knowing that it doesn't have to be a contradiction between this and engaging within the rest of the world. But there needs to be a balance. It is essential for countries also to maintain national democratic control and not to cede unlimited sovereignty to decide important political issues to other countries, organizations, and international courts. This should not be ignored. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wald. Now I call Mr. Soboliev. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Bakayanis, for your possibility to discuss very openly and honestly a new international order. But first of all, we had to understand when it's changed. Everything that we name it's a new international order. The times after the World War II, it was very realistic, cynic, but understandable. Two main blocks, the forming of new organizations as United Nations, NATO, European Union, our organization, so-called Soviet camp. But then something happened. The collapse of Soviet Union and the new forming of new organizations, of strengthening of old organizations. But then again, new times. What are these times? Without the definition of this year, when new order began to form after the collapse of Soviet Union, it's not even the invasion of Russia against Ukraine. It was 2008, when Russia occupied a big territory of independent Georgia. And we find a new international order when such huge allies of Georgia as the United States, as European Union, as our organization, keep silence, or not keep silence, only announcing as strong speeches, and that's enough. After this, it was occupation of Crimea, part of Ukraine, then full invasion of Russia to Ukraine. So without the meaning of new international order, where the main idea of new international order, how to save our planet from total collapse, we can't answer the main ideas what we need to put here. United Nations organization. It's like a toy in the hands of 5 big countries. NATO. We see that now NATO is not fulfill its main role for what it was built. European Union, sanctions of European Union. It's nothing in the comparison of the allies of Russia as Northern Korea, as China, as Iran. Remember, these all countries, Iran and China, or for example, Northern Korea, they have international sanctions. Now they are all in this order, try to fulfill their own task of dictator regimes. So I think it's only the beginning. And thank you for the start of this discussion. I think that we need more and more discussion in order to answer what means and how we can save new international order and our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soboliev. Now I call Mr. Kenbey. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear President, dear colleagues, I would first like to thank the rapporteur for her timely and comprehensive work in presenting the simple yet frightening reality before us. Current global governance mechanisms are inefficient and not fully equipped to address global change in a timely and effective manner. To achieve a truly effective international system, we should not only advocate but also resolutely pursue comprehensive reforms to make the order more representative, democratic, equitable, and transparent. This is especially relevant for the United Nations Security Council. Dear colleagues, as currently identified in the report, we live in an increasingly multipolar and interdependent world, facing complex and interconnected challenges that are often exacerbated by one another. Moreover, the current international order and its institutions were not created solely by the West. Other and older parts of the world have also played a major role and contributed to the evaluation of the current order. And they will and should continue to do so in the future. But what we are witnessing is exactly the opposite. Therefore, if the international system and its institutions are to be renewed, it is imperative to move beyond a Western-centric approach and to consider the ideas, concerns, and interests of other regions in an inclusive approach. In the interest of preserving and promoting international cooperation, peace, security, and the protection of human rights, it is essential to develop rules and principles that facilitate mechanisms and institutions consistent with this philosophy. They should be neither exclusionary nor declaratory, but provide a basis on which we can find at least a minimum of common ground. In the meantime, the West should reflect on its own action and consider how to address and resolve its missteps and shortcomings. This should include avoiding the application of double standards in international conflicts, adopting an inclusive approach to avoid inflaming ongoing crises, and respecting the views and values of other parties in international relations rather than imposing its own. Finally, I refer to the statement of our President Erdogan underlining this need. The world is bigger than five, and a fairer world is possible. The question is whether there is the political will to act in such a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kanbey. Now the floor is for Ms. Dunja Simonovic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, first I want to congratulate the rapporteur on this challenging subject and on her courage to summarize the biggest issues in world's politics today. Reading this report, I have even recognized a glimpse of hope, and for the moment I felt really good. Let me share this feeling with you. The rapporteur has grave concerns about international order, multilateral organizations, peace and justice. The rapporteur urges on respecting UN and UN Charter, strongly condemns replacement of international law with a rule of force, and strongly support respect sovereignty and territorial integrity within international recognized borders of all states. Members of Parliament from the Republic of Serbia are telling you the same since Kosovo is trying to become a member of Council of Europe. In April last year, very same rapporteur loudly advocated for the Kosovo membership. A lot of you voted for Kosovo becoming a member of this organization. I will remind you also that Kosovo has no recognition as a state in the UN. Also, we could read from this report that first aggression on the European soil after the Second World War was on Ukraine 3 years ago, but that is not true. 25 years ago, USA administration and NATO, without approval of UN Security Council, attacked my country and took away its southern part, which we call Kosovo and Metohija. That was the momentum when international order in Europe collapsed. Let's be clear. If you want to renew international order or to establish the new world order, you must return to the basics and admit that you made a huge mistake. After doing so, you should all start to advocate the UN Charter and territorial integrity and sovereignty of every single country in the world. Finally, the circle would be closed and new era would become. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Simonovic. Now the floor is for Mr. Claude Kern. The floor is yours. So, he's here, but okay. So, shall we go to Ms. Yulkakian? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, let me express my gratitude and extend my congratulations to the rapporteur, Honorable Ms. Dora Bakoyannis, for this extremely important report. Last year, the Armenian Prime Minister, Mr. Nikol Pashinyan, stated that an additional measure to ensure security for Armenia is the legitimacy, the legitimate expectations, the alignment of the Republic of Armenia's actions with international law and the global order. This statement sparked widespread discussion. Is international law still viable? Is it wise to cling to a world order that is visibly collapsing before our eyes? Skeptics argued that discussing the importance of international law is unreasonable when we see that more than 200 square kilometers of Armenia's sovereign territory are occupied by Azerbaijan, when we witness burning conflicts in various corners of the world, and when we see that the rule of force prevails, allowing the mighty to do whatever they want, regardless of the global order. Can we speak about international order, about importance of the international law, when we see that the rulings of the international courts, the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights are not implemented? When we see that the rulings of the International Court of Justice are not implemented, the ones of the International Criminal Court are ignored. International law is not perfect indeed. It has numerous shortcomings, particularly issues related to its enforcement, given the lack of effective mechanisms to compel adherence to international law. But can this become a reason to abandon international law and global order? To answer this question, I often make a comparison between international and domestic laws. Just as we adopt domestic legislation to regulate relationships within society, international law and the global order are designed to regulate relations between the states. And within our countries, we never debate abolishing the entire legal system because a legal provision does not function as intended. Instead, we either amend the law or improve the mechanism for its enforcement. What do we do when judicial acts ruled by domestic courts are not implemented? We ensure their enforcement rather than abandoning the idea of having courts. Similarly, rather than rejecting international law and the global order due to their imperfections, we must strive to refine them, strengthen enforcement mechanisms, and adapt them to the realities of the modern world. So there is definitely a need for a renewed international order. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, we need strong mechanisms to enforce implementation of the international law, implementation of the judicial acts of the international courts. So thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Rapporteur, for this report, and I hope that the international community will stay strong towards the renewed international world order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yulia Kian. Now the floor is for Ms. Olena Komenko. The floor is yours.
and gentlemen, today we need to ask ourselves what do we expect from human rights organizations like the Council of Europe and how we can keep them efficient. First, we must ensure that there is no impunity for the worst human rights violations. A key step for ensuring justice for victims of Russian war of aggression was establishing the compensation mechanism and the register of damage. The special tribunal for the crime of aggression is what must be put in place now. War criminals must be brought to justice because the unpunished evil grows. In this regard, it is also important and critical to respect the warrants issued by the International Criminal Court and uphold the authority we have given it. Second, no country can ensure its security alone. We must stand together because security is the backbone of the human rights we all cherish. Europe's capacity to defend its physical borders, its citizens, and its founding values against both military and hybrid threats must be strengthened, reducing its dependence on non-European allies. Europe must be ready to respond decisively to any aggression against its member states or partner countries. And here I'd like to remind you that it is impossible to expect security guarantees and support from allies while continuing to depend on energy supplies from Moscow. This contradiction must end. Today, Ukraine stands as a guarantor of peace and human rights in Europe and for Europe. And it needs your support to fulfill this role and protect its people from Russian genocidal fury. However, just and lasting peace we all strive to achieve requires learning from past mistakes. Weakness and short-sightedness in security guarantees for Ukraine must not be repeated. The window for correcting these errors is open now. Let's not miss it. Let's make Europe truly independent, strong, and free from those who seek to disrupt our homes. Let's make Europe make common sense again. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you, dear Elena. Now, before I call the next speaker, I must remind you that the vote is in progress to elect the 3 judges to European Court of Human Rights. The poll will close at 1 p.m., so those who have not voted yet are called to please vote. It's behind here, the area. So the floor now is for Ms. Cristiana Eroticro, if I'm right. Yeah. The floor is yours.
The microphone. Yes, it's working. Good. Dear colleagues, first and foremost, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mrs. Bakoyannis, for this excellent report. Amidst the rising geopolitical tensions in both Europe and the Middle East, unilateral acts of aggression against sovereign states, unprecedented humanitarian crises, and disregard for international norms have seriously undermined multilateralism and people's trust in international institutions. Extremist narratives are on the rise, not only across the Atlantic, but also in the European Parliament, as well as among us here in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Developments are worrisome. Autocratic regimes invade and occupy the territories of sovereign states, whilst the rest of the world appears shocked, yet unable to stop these blatant acts of aggression. The far right continues to soar in numbers unseen since the end of the Second World War. Hateful rhetoric, fake news, propaganda, and artificial intelligence, whose overall impact has yet to be measured, have taken over the internet. Our world order has dramatically shifted. Even though Europe has always positioned itself as a beacon of democracy, and our organization more specifically as the watchdog for the protection of human rights and the rule of law, at the same time we have tolerated violations of international law in Crimea, in Ukraine, in Nagorno-Karabakh and Cyprus, my own country that continues to be militarily occupied 50 years after the Turkish invasion of 1974. These fault lines merit careful consideration, particularly today, where the current state of play dictates that we must redefine what form of multilateralism is best suited to advance world peace and international stability. It is evident that we are moving from multilateral cooperation to fragmentation, multipolarity and isolation. In order to resist this trend and the continuing erosion of public trust in our democratic institutions, we must reposition Europe as a leader in global governance and remain firmly committed to common rules and basic responsibilities as the only way to resolve shared challenges and advance common aims. We must also address our own shortcomings and internal challenges, notably populism, democratic backsliding, and the rise of extreme rhetoric, both from the left and the right. Accountability mechanisms must be established or strengthened and perpetrators of grave human rights violations brought to justice. The Council of Europe can serve as a role model for regional cooperation and partnership, while key international institutions like the ICC must be further empowered. Moreover, the UN, as a bedrock of the international order, must undergo significant reforms to become more inclusive, transparent, representative and responsive to the changing realities of global politics. To effectively address global challenges, from climate change to armed conflicts and human rights abuses, we must ensure that all nations, regardless of their size or power, have a meaningful voice in shaping the future of our international system. The cost of further inaction will be far greater than the challenges of renewing a rules-based international order. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Autokrito. Now I call Mr. Vardanian. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would first congratulate reporter Ms. Dora Bakoyannis for an excellent and very timely report. I would like to say that when I started my academic career, everybody, almost all my students, criticized some 20 years ago the very existence of international law, using each and every opportunity to criticize it. Where are we now? We are now thinking about coming back to the situation that this international law existed and functioned as it was. What was the main achievement of UN system? What was the main achievement of current international law? What is its difference in comparison with the classic international law? In classic international law, the war was allowed, but it was considered as last resort, ultima ratio. What was the achievement of United Nations system? Because United Nations system prohibit war at all. It brings us to the international law, which we called jus contra bellum, law against the war. Where are we now? We are in a situation where, unfortunately, war is not even a last resort. War becomes the first resort. And here we should go ahead with the coming back to the roots of international law and the UN system, because it's the only logical way of development of international law. Dear colleagues, if a system is corrupted, there is no limits, there is no rules, and there is no possibilities to go ahead. If we wouldn't come back to the system existed under the United Nations, we wouldn't come back to the classic international law where the war considered as a last resort. We would come back to the prehistorical times where, believe me, neither territory, nor population, nor sovereignty will have zero impact. Because if you have no legal order, if you have no rules under international law, you cannot speak about any kind of development worldwide. And here, dear colleagues, I do believe that altogether we should think about not just bringing the system of international law back to the pre-UN period, but we should think about the following. We should develop the international law in its moral logic, because all the development of international law was bring this body of law to humanitarian approach. In 21st century, we should build together with you international law with the human face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vardanian. Now I call Mr. Andrei Hunko. The floor is yours. He's not here. So the last one is Miss Lopez Rabadan Kenya. The floor is yours. She is here.
She's there.
Con su permiso, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My name is Kenya Lopez Rabadan. I represent the largest opposition party in Mexico. As you know, I think we are looking now at a new way of looking on the world, and I think that is something that concerns all countries.
Normas. A new and rule-based international order, not based on power, on money, or on ideology. The polarization and rising nationalism have generated difficult climates in which governments are facing the increasing lack of well-being of their citizens, and this has to stop. Today, my country, Mexico, is undergoing one of the greatest challenges of the last decades. Millions of Mexicans who emigrated to the United States, our northern neighbor country, may possibly be deported, and this will have social and economic consequences for both countries. We need to recognize our differences, but above all, to create legal spaces, both in the universal order and the regional one, that correspond to these new visions of what the public sector should do. Security, trade relations, artificial intelligence, protection of human rights are all priority subjects for a new world order. The European Union is a clear positive example of the need for countries to cooperate with one another so as to strengthen regions. Building an international order which is transparent, realistic, and above all, with shared rules that defend human rights of all persons is indispensable. Mexico and the European Union have an association which is not simply economic, but also a form of political consultation and cooperation. As friends and partners, I would wish that spaces of dialogue such as this Parliamentary Assembly be useful for creating bridge building, for understanding, cooperation, and respect for the dignity of persons and of their freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Now I call Mr. Alexander Merajerko. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So great to be back. The issue of reform of the United Nations is a crucial issue not only of the international rules-based order, but also a crucial issue of humankind's future and its survival. And this issue has very long history, sometimes disappointing and sometimes hopeless. The major problem here is the lack of political will to reform the United Nations on the part of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Those members don't want to give up their veto power and thereby are not interested in the genuine reform of the United Nations. Because of that, the United Nations has turned into a helpless debate club like the League of Nations and is absolutely incapable to perform its major function, which is maintenance of international peace and security. The UN has failed to stop Russian aggression and to defend one of its founding members, Ukraine, against the criminal terrorist state, Russia, which had illegally usurped the seat of the USSR on the Security Council in violation of the UN Charter. What is the solution to this crisis of the UN? Enlargement, which is, by the way, proposed in the draft of the resolution, enlargement of the membership of the Security Council is not such a solution, because there are no reliable objective criteria to pick the new Security Council's members. The solution is to cancel the veto power and special status of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Structure and work of the UN should be based on the principle of sovereign equality of states and not on the special privileges of some countries. If we want true peace in the world, if we want rule of law in international relations, we need authentic and radical reform of the UN, despite resistance from some permanent members of the Security Council. And if, because of this resistance, the reform fails, then the international community should create a new, effective and just international organization of collective security, instead of hopeless and obsolete UN. And I would like to invite you as representatives of your people to join in this project to change, to reform the UN, or to create a new, effective international organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merezenko. Now I must interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speaker list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that the typewritten text can be submitted electronically, if possible, not later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. Now I call Ms. Bakoyannis, the rapporteur, to reply. Ms. Bakoyannis, you have 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. President. Dear colleagues, first allow me to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the President of the European Court of Human Rights, Mr. Marko Bošnjak, and to all of you who have spoken for your invaluable insights. The depth and breadth of your interventions are a powerful testament to the urgency Europe must embrace to address the profound challenges threatening the international rules-based order. One thing is clear from what has been said in this room: the Council of Europe must remain a cornerstone of a renewed international rules-based order. In an era of escalating uncertainty and geopolitical tension, our mission is more essential than ever. The Council's unparalleled role in championing human rights, democracy, and the rule of law endows it with a competence duty that rises above political divisions. The Council of Europe stands as a testament to what can be achieved when nations come together in pursuit of common goals. It is not merely a platform for discussion, but a driving force for action. To defend the rules-based international order and address the most significant challenges to humanity's existence, we must foster deeper cooperation, not only among ourselves, but also with global partners who may not fully share our vision of the world. Setting barriers too high to climb will only exacerbate the global trend towards fragmentation. Moreover, being too quick to assign blame, whether among member states of the Council of Europe or beyond, will only reinforce the perception held by many countries of Western double standards and hypocrisy. Dear colleagues, this is not a time for retreat or hesitation. It is a time for boldness and resolve. European citizens are looking to us, seeking solutions to the major challenges they face. If we fail to act together. If we cannot set aside the extreme voices of ethno-populism and achieve deeper European integration, it won't be long before those same citizens turn their back to us. Together, we can ensure that the legacy of this Council endures as a symbol of unity and strength. With those words, I ask you to vote in favor of this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Dora. Now, does the chairperson of the committee, Mr. Bertrand Vaux, wish to speak? You have 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam Rapporteur, dear Dora. Mr. President of the European Court of Human Rights, dear colleagues. 80 years after the liberation of the concentration camps, which we commemorated yesterday here in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe, and at the end of the Second World War, the world seems once again to wish to plunge into the abyss. A world where the strongest impose their vision and interest on the others, including by using disproportionate military force. This is international disorder, a lawless system, or a system where there are rules but subject to variable geometry which are only imposed on the weakest. We see this happening all around us, and we Europeans cannot possibly accept this. When I say Europeans, I'm obviously talking about all the peoples of the countries that make up our organization, which has never been as necessary as it is now to stop the world from unraveling, to paraphrase the words of my compatriot Albert Camus when he received his Nobel Prize. A delegation of the Political Affairs Committee, which I chair, went to New York to have political and legal meetings at high level, led by our colleague Marietta Caramande. And, it must be said, the temple of multilateralism is unsteady, dear colleagues. The system is stuck because no country, and in particular the United States, China, and Russia, wishes to cooperate with the others, but only to impose their own will. It's been paralyzed at least since 2014, when Russian troops entered Crimea, and still more since that same country attacked the whole Ukraine. We met with French and British representatives of the Security Council, and the cooperation between these two countries is essential because just those two managed to get most Security Council resolutions passed. This cooperation needs to continue, just as that which links together European countries. The world's balance is at stake. The system is blocked because of reasons from outside the United Nations, but also internal reasons. Who could have thought that the balance of power that came from the Second World is still today the same? Where are India and Brazil or Germany in this system? On September 22nd, 2024, the General Assembly adopted a resolution which wished to change some rules which organized the international order, including the broadening of the makeup of the Security Council of the United Nations so as to make it more representative, but also to change the way in which standing members may use their veto. And it is urgent to get such a reform through because the consequence of inaction is not just that standing members such as France would remain in power in the world order, but simply that things will happen elsewhere or not at all. You have only to have a look at the BRICS summit or the G20 to see that the Security Council is ever more marginalized. And this is not something to which we can be resigned. Our organization has a role to play here, a role as a compass in the international system, as the oldest regional organization promoting democracy and the rule of law. And we should participate more in the United Nations system. Our colleague Ms. Bakoyannis' resolution has come at just the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vaux. Now I declare the debate closed. The Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy has presented a draft resolution to which 27 amendments have been tabled. Also, they have presented a draft recommendation to which 2 amendments have been tabled. We will begin by considering the draft resolution first. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by committee, sized for a report, shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 12, 11, 13, 16, and 17, and also 27 to the draft resolution, which were unanimously approved, be declared as approved. Amendment 24 and 19 have also been agreed unanimously, but as there are consequential amendments, they will be taken separately. Is that so, Mr. Boaks? So, if no one objects, I will consider the amendment to be approved. Is there any objection? If there, we will need to verify that the objector have the required support of 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hands? See no one? It's okay. So, Amendment 12, 11, 13, 16, 17, and 27 to the draft resolution. 26 to the draft resolution are therefore approved. They will not be called. So, rejection of amendment in committee by 2/3 of majority. Any amendment which has been rejected by the committee says for report by 2/3 majority of the votes cast shall not be put to the vote in plenary, shall be declared as definitively rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 9, 10, 6, 7, 1, 5, 14, 15, 2, 8, 21, 20, 22, 3, 25, 27, and 4 to the draft resolution, which were rejected by the committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. Amendments 23 and 18 have also been rejected with a 2/3 majority, but as there are consequential amendments, they will be taken separately. Is that so, Mr. Boaks?
Oui, c'est bien ça.
Yes, that is the case.
Okay, if no objection, I will consider the amendments to be rejected. Is there any objection? If there is, we will need to verify that objection has the required support for 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hand? I see there are not. So, Amendment 9, 10, 6, 7, 1, 5, 14, 15, 2, 8, 21, 20, 22, 3, 25, 27, and 4 of the draft resolution are therefore rejected and will not be called. Amendment 16 was adopted by the committee. However, I have received an oral amendment from the committee which reads as follows. Paragraphs 11.3 as amended be moved to paragraph 12. The President may accept an oral amendment on the ground of the promoting clarity, accuracy, and conciliation if there is not opposition from the 10 or more members to it being debated. In my opinion, the oral amendment does not meet the criteria of Rule 34.7a. Therefore, there are any opposition to the amendment being debated? So, this is not the case. I therefore call Mrs. The one that I don't have the name. Ms. Bakoyannis to support the oral amendments. You have 30 seconds.
Change of paragraph. It's just we just want to add the amendment, but change the numbers. So I think it's from 18 to 19, something like this. The Secretariat will do the writing.
As it's just a technical issue, I think that shall be approved as so. Does anybody wish to speak against the oral amendment? As I see no one, so the committee is obviously in favor. I shall now put the oral amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The oral amendment is agreed with 111 votes.
Page 32.
Yeah. Have been voted, 102 in favor and 3 against.
So page 32 is next.
23.
32.
32. I call Mr. George Lucades to support Amendment 23. You have 30 seconds. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The aim of this amendment is, I thought it was finished, isn't it? Do we have to argue? Didn't we vote?
So the Secretariat is telling me that because there are consequential amendments, they have to be taken separately.
Voted unanimously or rejected by 2/3.
These amendments are consequential, so they must be taken.
These amendments are consequential, so they have to be taken.
Anyway, I had the impression that we have accepted that those amendments were rejected by 2/3 majority. They don't stand a chance in the hemicycle to be accepted. So we wanted to assist the procedure to proceed with the discussion and conclusion of the discussion of this item. But I don't know if there is a need to proceed and vote for it. I could do it, yes. The argumentation and the aim of this proposal is related to the different roles that we have as Council of Europe with the European Union. We believe that our aim is to promote our values and principles, not speak on behalf of the European Union, not adopting or rejecting policies of the European Union that has to do with the decisions taken in the European Union's level. We are not European Union.
Does anyone want to speak against? Robert. The committee rejected this amendment with 2/3 of majority. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. 23 in favor, 81 against. The amendment is rejected.
Page 36.
36. I'll call Mr. George Lucades to support Amendment 19. You have 30 seconds.
Amendment 19 was agreed, wasn't it? So I think it was unanimously agreed by the committee. That was the case, so I don't think there is a need to support it.
Does anyone speak against? Nobody. The committee unanimously accepted this amendment. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call now for the result to be displayed. So 101 in favor, 7 against. The amendment is agreed. We will now proceed to vote to the draft resolution containing document number 16087 as amended. A simple majority is required. The vote is now open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. So we have 109 in favor, 10 against. So the draft resolution in document 16087 as amended is adopted. Congratulations, Mr. Rapporteur. Congratulations also to Mr. Boaks, the committee. Now we will consider the draft recommendation. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by the committee says for the report shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitely approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 27 to the draft recommendation, which was unanimously approved, be declared as approved. Is that so, Mr. Boaks?
Oui, c'est ça.
That is the case.
Object. I will consider the amendment to be approved. Is there any objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hands? No objection. So, Amendment 28 to the draft recommendation is therefore approved and will not be called. Any amendments which has been rejected by the... Oh, okay. I already did this. Any amendments which has been rejected by the committee says for the report by a 2/3 majority of the votes cast shall not be put to the vote in plenary, shall be declared as definitely rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 29 to the draft recommendation, which was by the committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. Is that so, Mr. Boaks?
C'est ça.
Yes, that is the case.
If no one objects, I will consider the amendments to be rejected. Is there an objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hands? The request, Amendment 29 to the draft recommendation is therefore rejected and will not be called. We'll now proceed to the vote of the draft recommendation contained in document 16087 as amended. I remind you that a 2/3 majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. So 106 in favor, 9 against. The draft recommendation in document is adopted as amended. Congratulations, Ms. Zora, and all the people that supported, colleagues. Our next business is to consider the changes proposed in the membership of committees. There are set out in document Commission 2025-01, Addendum 2. Are the proposed changes in the membership of the Assembly Committee agreed to? They are agreed to. So it is now nearly 1 p.m. Does any member still wish to vote in the election of 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights? The ballot for electing 3 judges to the European Court of Human Rights is now closed. The counting of votes will take place under the supervision of the tellers, Mr. Sergei Vlasenko, Ms. Agnes Pramer, Ms. Rian Vogels, and Mr. Berdan Ostur. I invite them to go at once to go to the count that will take place in the meeting room on 5th floor. The result of the election will be announced at the opening of the afternoon sitting. The Assembly will hold its next public sitting this afternoon and 3:30 p.m. with the agenda approved on Monday. The sitting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, that was